So as promised, I'm going to share the contents of the second booklet that I created during this season. The first one I just did a video for was How to Combat Hate, Racism, and Prejudice, a guide for everyday individuals. This one is How to End Police Brutality and Develop Equitable Law Enforcement, a beginning guide for community members. So this is really created for individuals who want to get involved and move beyond protest against police brutality, who want to get involved in deinstitutionalizing racism within law enforcement. It's also for police officers who want to understand maybe more about why people protest or what that perspective is from the community side, from the civilian side. It's also a booklet that would be helpful for any kind of civilian oversight of law enforcement, commissions, committees, that kind of thing. So activists, nonprofits can also find this useful. So this is just a little guide. I'm going to read the contents to you and kind of expound upon them a little bit. So the booklet starts with just a brief history. The history is about policing in America. This is, of course, specific to the United States. So the history includes kind of the concept that policing started in the North and in the South in different ways. So in the North, it was for profit. Policing was primarily engaged in protecting businesses and operated as a for-profit industry, much like security guards at a mall or facilities operate today. So it was oriented toward protecting the products, the merchandise, and the facility of a business. In the South, of course, the business of the South in the United States during the 1800s and 1700s was, the plantations. And so business really was wrapped up with that ancient oppression, the original sin in the United States of chattel slavery. So early police in the South were hired to protect the interests of those plantation owners, which included capturing and sometimes torturing or even killing runaway enslaved African people, thwarting the efforts of the Underground Railroad, and protecting the plantation owners. So it was a very biased system, protecting and serving certain individuals, aka the nominally white slave owners, and not protecting or serving the Black community, the individuals in the South who came from the African continent directly. So that's kind of how the policing system was set up in American history, and remnants of that still carry on today, and that kind of embedded history and memory still lingers in terms of institutionalized racism being a part of many police departments. So after slavery ended in the South, Jim Crow laws were instituted and enforced by police, segregation, including denied access to land ownership, which was again enforced by the cops, loitering laws, and sundown laws, all kind of for the purpose of incarcerating much of the newly freed Black population in the South, because that 13th Amendment included, of course, emancipation, except in the event of incarceration. So slave labor is still allowed in the state of incarceration. And so with that caveat, that clause, that's why 90% of incarcerated individuals in the South right after emancipation flipped from, being mostly white incarcerated individuals to mostly Black. So after emancipation, the prison systems were filled up quickly with Black men And a lot of that had to do with the police instituting segregation laws, loitering laws. It was not legal to not have a job. It was not legal to sit on the sidewalk. It was not legal to be out after dark. It was, you know, there are all these random laws that you could be arrested for violating if you were Black. And if you're a white person in the South, you would not be arrested for those very same things due to the Jim Crow separate and unequal treatment. So that's kind of, you know, the little brief history there. When it comes to Neighborhood Watch, some people say, well, why is the Trayvon Martin case, the Ahmaud Arbery case, why are cases like that compared to Tamir Rice and George Floyd and some of the police brutality? Well, because the history of Neighborhood Watch is very similar in that embedded racism as the history of policing. So racial bias was embedded into the first Neighborhood Watch committees in the American South, with white mobs being quickly called to action to enforce Jim Crow laws and segregation, or even perceived violations of the Jim Crow laws. These Neighborhood Watch groups were oftentimes led by Klan members, and were the primary force of bringing what was known as mob justice to Black civilians through oftentimes lynching. So the Neighborhood Watch programs, you know, oftentimes included the judge, jury, and executioner rights and abilities without any recourse. So people were not held accountable for those lynchings. So there was no justice or law enforcement of, holding the white mob accountable for killing a Black individual. So why this history matters, again, is because it's important for white cops and civilians to understand that the Black community has a different starting point with law enforcement. The starting point is not, protecting and serving Black lives in America. There's a starting point of distrust, of anxiety, and perceived threat of the cop. So to build trust, proof of change in policy and practice must be evident and ongoing. Nearly every Black American has a personal story or knows a family member who has had a bad experience with police. So when every American citizen can point to good experiences or times when they felt protected and served by cops, we will know that change is happening. When those critical incidents and violent incidents are no longer part of the ongoing lived experience, triggering these memoirs of the past history and the very foundation for law enforcement in America. So that being kind of the backdrop from which we protest against police brutality, what can you do? So I've kind of scored out some everyday actions for everyday people, things that you can do as just a random citizen, that you are empowered to make change and contribute to the movement beyond protest. So of course, like I said in my last video, protest is important, and this is not in any way competing with the idea of protest or trying to discourage anyone from protesting. Quite the opposite. It's just, how do we move beyond the protest and into really making these changes? Because the protest calls for awareness and it calls for action, and then we need to start taking that action to make this change. So voting is the first action that you can take under what you can do as just a random person, a random individual, everyday American citizen. Voting is crucial to changing the police culture in America, because your vote, not in the presidential election cycle sometimes, but in your local mayoral race, your vote for the mayor is actually going to directly impact who the chief of police is. So the mayor picks the chief of police. And that means that whoever you vote in for mayor is going to set the tone by that appointment of chief of police, and set the tone for whether policing is going to, be held accountable, whether the policies, the culture in general of the officers is going to be specifically and intentionally anti-racist, moving away from that racist history, or whether it's just going to fall in line with business as usual, how things have operated throughout much of American history. So vote for the mayor in your local city. Also vote for the sheriff, because the sheriff is the second branch of law enforcement. The third branch is the highway patrol. So the sheriff's office is also an elected office. So make sure that you know who is running for sheriff and vote in that cycle. And of course, we know that the voting cycles for these local elections often are sneaky, like they come in August or March or May or whenever. They're not always during November. They're not always during a presidential election cycle. So you have to stay alert, watchful, and make sure that you vote, as early as you can, and as informed and educated as you can for those local races, because that really does shape your local experience, your safety, the safety of your children, and so forth when it comes to law enforcement. So number 2 in what you can do as a just average person is educate yourself and those you love. So know your rights and responsibilities as a civilian when interacting with cops, and become familiar with your city and state's policies and process for policing, for law enforcement. So you're aware of what is working well and what needs the most urgent change, so that you know really what to focus on. A lot of police departments operate differently. So what happens in Missouri is not necessarily directly applicable to what's something that's going on in Alaska or Florida or whatever. So state laws vary, local policies vary, and actions fall in line with those laws and policies oftentimes. So make sure that you educate yourself about what's happening in your community, so you know what to address, at a city council meeting, or what to address with your activism, what needs to change. Attend municipal meetings. So city council, neighborhood watch, police ombudsman commission, those kind of meetings are an important place to hear the issues that decision makers are actually addressing in your community, and to voice your concerns about those issues. So, or you can even raise awareness, of course, about issues that they are clearly overlooking, that they're not focusing on. So oftentimes there's kind of a limited time allotment. If you haven't participated in one of these meetings previously, just FYI, a lot of times for these meetings, there's like a 2 to 3 minute slot allowed for comments, or for citizens to kind of air grievances, or to kind of request, that these decision makers look at something specifically. So make sure that you have your thoughts prepared and ready to deliver that really concise, short presentation. And that goes back to that second item of, you need to, educate yourself and know exactly what you're asking, like what your demands are, and deliver that within the time limit. Number 4 is report. So we know that if you witness a bias incident, be sure to document as much information as possible and submit a formal report. I know a lot of people have lost faith with the reporting process, but submit that report or complaint through the ombudsman's office, or whatever process your city has, is civilian oversight of law enforcement. There's usually a reporting process for complaints. Also, of course, make copies of the report before you submit it, so that you have that documentation to give to elected officials and go up the food chain in terms of having a better chance at intervention. If you don't file that initial report, it's harder to then go to the mayor's office or go to a city councilman or woman and air your grievances because you haven't followed, the protocol or the policy or the process, I guess, for, how to submit that complaint. And if you don't follow the process that's already been prepared for reporting, then oftentimes you won't get the ear of the elected officials in helping you move that report forward to get justice or to find that intervention that you're seeking. So, if you follow the process, then obviously raising public awareness, puts additional pressure on the police department and those who have engaged in that incident of bias or whatever that situation is that you're reporting. Number 5, of course, not to overlook this because it is important: protest and volunteer. So collective civil disobedience and peaceful protests send a clear message to decision makers that large numbers of people, specifically how many people really care about this issue. Is it just a few people, a lot of people, or a massive amount, like most of the people, most of the voters, most of the civilians who care about demanding change on a particular topic? So the numbers matter because they signify public interest, and voters and those elected officials will be listening once they see the numbers in the streets. So if you can't protest, some other ways to participate in protest and volunteerism is to consider volunteering supplies, like bringing water to protesters, food, help make signs, babysit for single moms, who want to protest, or volunteer for a nonprofit that is involved in justice work and criminal justice reform and public safety work. So those are some of the everyday actions that you can do to get involved. If you want to go beyond that, of course, running for an elected office, becoming part of a police ombudsman commission, becoming the ombudsman, the police ombudsman, to hold police accountable, or even, becoming a police officer and trying to use your agency within the force to make change. So there's so many different levels of how to get involved, but just for an everyday person, these are some things that you can do that really will make a difference. And again, the more people that you get to do these things with you, the bigger the difference is. On the next page, I have a checklist to kind of, just as a starting point, if you're not sure, like, does my police department where I live actually need reform, or should we defund this police department, or what's really going on with the police department? Like, where should we start? So these are some things to look for. If your local police department is lacking in any of these items on this checklist, then these are some starting points for areas to advocate for reform. So number 1 is paid positions for civilian oversight of law enforcement with decision-making, not only recommendation, authority. So if police are paid, but the civilian oversight is unpaid or volunteer, that's not a fair balance. That's not a balance at all. That's imbalanced. The power balance is not equal in that situation. If the Civilian Oversight Commission, the Ombudsman or Review Board can only recommend change, but cannot make decisions about change, then that's also an imbalance. So consider that, if all the volunteers and all of the people involved can only recommend, we should get some body cameras, or you should wear the body cameras, or whatever it is, then the police department can just basically say, like, no, we don't want to. They don't have to. If recommendation authority is as far as your city goes for police accountability. So check that out. Number 2, sufficient limits to police guilds and police unions' ability to protect the cops. These are the groups that protect cops and secure their pensions when biased and critical incidents occur. So even if a cop is convicted of murder in a use of force incident, which is extremely rare. Almost never does that happen. But even if that happens, that cop still is protected by oftentimes a police guild who will secure his pension for, $1 million, $2 million, whatever, into the future. So that's a level of accountability that's missing. There's a gap there in accountability if those police guilds and unions do not have a limit to their reach. Okay, so number 3, communication and collaboration between civilian oversight of law enforcement and the Department of Justice. So is there communication, going on between the Ombudsman Commission or the Civilian Review Board and the Department of Justice? Because, for example, under Obama's collaborative reform policies with the DOJ, there are a lot of great ideas for reform, and those ideas cannot be implemented in a local municipal place unless there's that collaboration with the DOJ. So number 4, anti-bias screening for hiring, anti-bias use of force training, effective cultural competency training, and prejudice reduction training within the police department. So are those 4 things on number 4 happening? If they're not, then that needs to be looked at. Number 5, representation of community demographics on the police force with regards to race and gender equity and promotions and leadership within the force as well. But in terms of, is your force actually one demographic and the community that's being policed by that force a different demographic, then there's something that needs to be looked at in terms of recruitment for officers, and can there be more representation built into the police force? Number 6, are there enough body cameras for all officers, and are they mandated, not just voluntarily used? So check those 2 things. Also, what's the maintenance like? Do they have audio and video, or is it just video? Also look at the dash cams, and the body cams. Can you see clearly? There are different makes, models, and programs for these dash cams and body cams. So make sure that the footage from the body cams and dash cams is made public when critical incidents occur. I know that in a lot of police departments, they say that's a violation of privacy, but in this culture today, the public is going to know through social media oftentimes, and so privacy is a lesser concern than accountability and rebuilding, or actually building for the first time, trust in law enforcement. So number 7, co-responders to accompany the police, like a mental health professional or other civilian assistant, to ensure equitable treatment during a police encounter, whether negotiating differences of ethnicity, of language, or disability even. Having someone present that is trusted by the civilian and respected by the cop will safeguard a less tense and volatile encounter that will be less likely to escalate into violence. So those are some things to look for, a little checklist. Look if your police department has those things in place. The next page is about critical incidents and justice. So use of deadly force when talking about gender and race. Police use of deadly force is one of the leading causes of death for young men in the United States. I cite all my sources in here. So studies have shown that 1 in 2,000 men and 1 in 33,000 women die as a result of police use of deadly force. So when it comes to gender, men are 33 times more likely, not 33 times, about 15 times more likely. So 1 in 2,000 men versus 1 in 33,000 women. And the highest risk is for guys, for the males, when gender only is being considered. So when it comes to Black men, not just men in general, the risk is 1 in 1,000. So it's double the rate of men in general. And according to the Guardian's data, fatal police shootings per million ranked, meaning per 1 million Black people, 1 million Native American people, 1 million white American people, 1 million Latino Americans, 1 million Asian Americans. So directly proportionate with the population, fatal police shootings tend to be the highest for Native Americans at 10.13, 6.6 next for Black Americans, 3.23 for Latino Americans, 2.9 for white Americans, and 1.17 for Asian Americans. So that kind of shows you just the raw data of the breakdown from Native to Black to Latino to white to Asian as far as risk assessment for fatal police shootings. That's a critical incident, not just police brutality in general, but a fatality or death occurring as a result of police brutality. So looking at America versus the world, the argument that use of deadly force is necessary for effective policing seems baseless, because countries with lower use of deadly force incidents than the US also oftentimes have lower crime rates. So it doesn't look like we have to, follow protocol per American habit pattern with policing in terms of use of force in order to keep crime rates down. So is carrying a gun or even wielding a deadly weapon the best way or the most effective way to curb crime? Per data compiled by the Prison Policy Initiative, American cops killed more than 3 times the number of civilians per 10 million citizens than Canada or Australia, their police. 15 times more than the police in the Netherlands, New Zealand, or Germany, and 30 times more than Japan, Norway, or Iceland. In sheer numbers, not adjusted for the size of the country, the US kills over 1,000 citizens annually by critical incidents by cop. And Canada comes in second with about 36 people. The UK averages only 3 deaths per year at the hands of police, and Norway and many other countries have 0 deaths. So that data really suggests that there's a fundamental and systemic problem in American policing around the use of deadly force. Getting justice is the last and final little tab here on critical incidents and justice. In the past 15 years, so with approximately then, if there's about 1,000 deadly encounters per year, that's about 15,000 deadly encounters. Only out of 15,000, only 110, a little teeny piece of that, officers have actually been charged with murder or manslaughter, and out of those 110, only 5 cops have been convicted of murder. So qualified immunity is one of the reasons for that under the Supreme Court, protecting officers from being sued when they're doing what they're supposed to be doing per policy and procedure on duty, which that's part of the problem, is the training and the policy and the procedure about using deadly force, but we'll get to that. So SUE immunity or qualified immunity is one of the reasons why it's so hard to get justice for these critical incidents. The police unions and guilds, their reach and their authority is another reason. And of course, the systemic bias favoring officers over civilians, and racial bias favoring white officers over Black civilians specifically, oftentimes biases, judges and juries, and that part of the process for getting justice. So a little bit of information there about critical incidents, why they occur, maybe, like how they don't have to occur per what other countries do, and then why justice is so elusive. On the next page, I talk about use of force, training, and also tools and weapons for policing. So When it comes to weaponry, some police departments lack clear rules on standardization of weapons. I know that that was one problem in a police department that I worked to hold accountable. So a closer look is needed for like what type of weapons are given to cops, what type of ammunition, how these weapons are worn, adequate training for the use of the weapon, of course, and even which cops should be carrying deadly weapons. Not all roles or particular routes probably need a gun, on hand. So some countries don't arm all cops with guns. That's another thing that we could probably learn from other countries. Sometimes a taser is the highest form of force in an altercation, and that's all that's needed. Communities should evaluate whether deadly weapons are needed for effective policing, and even again the type of like hollow bullets or whatever. Sometimes the ammunition can mean the difference of someone recovering from a gunshot wound or dying on the scene. So training and bias is the next section. Past weaponry there. Use of force training, including person-to-person and virtual training programs, need evaluated for inherent bias in the curriculum, the scenarios, and trainers like delivering the methodology and training to incoming officers often need evaluated for that inherent bias as well. So developing culturally literate and equitable use of force training and cultural competency and prejudice reduction training for all officers is crucial. Even the veteran officers, not always just the incoming newbies, but we've got to look at those people who've been on the force for a while and have gotten a little too comfortable and too used to business as usual under a systemically racist department or institution such as law enforcement. So bias screening is also needed for applicants and recruits. And, I think even some of those tenured officers could stand to go through some bias screening as well and become, I feel like that should become a part of standard practice of hiring and professional development ongoing for police departments to really ensure that racism isn't brewing and growing, within the force. So this is an important part of also building public trust and developing a culture of zero tolerance for racism, hate, and prejudice in policing. So I hope you've enjoyed that little booklet. It's brief. These booklets are brief. They're kind of, for readers and non-readers alike because they're bullet points and they're quick and they're easy to digest and easy to understand. You can get this for free on my website, racheldolezal.com, as well as that first booklet, How to Combat Hate, Racism, and Prejudice. You can get both of the booklets for free. You can get one of them. And definitely, if you know somebody who could use it, or if you want to utilize this, feel free to get your copy. So if you have any questions about the content, I'm also happy to engage in the comments. I wanted to kind of go over the booklet just because, it's helpful to have a little video, a little read. Sometimes people can listen to a podcast or just listen to the audio of a video. And it's a little easier on your commute home from work or whatever than reading something that's in print. So I hope this is helpful. These little booklets are just practical tools, just putting it out there as kind of a community service, a little tool to use for everyday activists or wannabe everyday activists who are just getting going in making a difference in your community.